Perfect.
Very good. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Jess. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to chat with some of my colleagues from around the country. What we're going to be looking at today is the idea of addressing some of those clients who perhaps are less than happy to be in group, individuals who, taking a look at Prochaska and DiClementi's continuum of stages of readiness to change, would fall into that precontemplative or contemplative stage of readiness to change. So although all practitioners develop their own style of running groups with clients having substance use disorders, their individual approaches play an important role in determining the ultimate sort of efficacy of that treatment modality. So things such as what it is that I expect as a practitioner of my clients, my understanding of a substance use disorder, what it is to be involved in group where the focus is on substance use disorders, recognizing that individual members of the group that I am working with can be at different stages of readiness to change, some at the very beginning where they are in that pre-contemplative or doubting that they have a problem stage, all the way up through those who perhaps are thankful to finally be in treatment and actively working on their substance use disorder. But in addition to the sort of personality and theoretical orientation of the practitioner and that of the individual, sort of the ideology of the individual client that is there, also the group is going to take on its own personality. So we'll be talking a little bit about what I like to affectionately refer to as gimmicks for group. And while these are strategies that I developed over the years that allowed me to accomplish particular objectives given the nature of a particular group with which I was working, I need to mention that these are simply suggestions and ideas that are open to the interpretation of any viewer. So just because something has been suggested doesn't necessarily mean that's the only way that that group can be effective. Obviously, you can sort of tweak them, if you will, in order to accomplish the goals that you have. But before we get any further into this, let me share a little bit of information about myself. I entered the substance use disorder treatment field back in the early 70s. And my first work in the field was in an outpatient capacity. And that work was almost exclusively with individuals. At most, it was working with individuals who perhaps, but it might have a spouse or significant other would come in. But my group work didn't begin until I took the position as the executive director of a small 4-county rural program in north central Pennsylvania. And at that time was introduced to doing groups on a regular basis. And I learned a lot about doing group work from my colleagues who were experienced group practitioners at that particular time. From there, I found myself gravitating to a clinical director position of an inpatient treatment program in Binghamton, New York, where every day individuals who are in that sort of traditionally oriented 28-day sort of model of inpatient treatment was exposed to 2 therapy groups, and in addition would be going either on the unit or off the unit to mutual aid or self-help groups, AA and NA, for example. From there, going on to work as I followed my wife to Philadelphia, where she had a position as a professor at St. Joseph's University, took on the position of working as the coordinator of the alcohol and other drug program at LaSalle University. And ended my career in the late, about 2006, was invited to join the faculty at Drexel University teaching the next generation of addictions counselors. So the experience that I've had has been pretty much, to use a cliche, all over the map. Inpatient, outpatient, intensive outpatient, working in rural and urban areas, working with traditional populations of substance use disorders and specifically collegiate populations. So what we'll be looking at today are some strategies and ideas, some, as I said, gimmicks that might be useful to address these kinds of issues. So when we start to take a look at the sort of the theoretical and ideological orientation of facilitators, it becomes important to recognize that what I expect as a practitioner can influence not only what I see in the individual members of my group, but also how they see me and how they see the group process as well. So as a facilitator working in a substance use related facility who views substance use as being the issue of primacy will approach groups differently than one who understands substance use is an important but not necessarily unique issue affecting client behavior. So likewise, where group members are on Prochaska's continuum of readiness to change and can affect how they will react to those particular group experiences, I found it important to sort of keep in mind what are sometimes referred to as the 4 A's of working with groups, and particularly if being a student of motivational interviewing, affirmation, acceptance, accurate empathy, and autonomy. And being able to sort of weave all of those 4 A's into the work that's being done with those particular individuals in the group. So a suggestion, just a sort of a general suggestion, can sometimes be to sort of take a step back and to look at the group as an entity and recognize that even though there are individuals with their own personalities in that group, that the group itself will take on a personality that is the composite of all of those different individual personalities. So for example, before beginning group work, recognizing that I'm working either in a closed group or an open group. An open group being sort of that group where the membership of the group is going to rotate with time. This oftentimes is the case when you see individuals coming into an inpatient treatment program, as members of the group will graduate from the program, or unfortunately sometimes sign themselves out of the program. A space becomes available in the group and new individuals will be admitted to the program and rotate into it. A closed group, this is oftentimes what you will see in a DUI program, driving under the influence program, where it starts with a set number of individuals and that set number of individuals constitutes the group during the duration of that experience. So it becomes important to sort of take a look at sort of understanding some of those dynamics as we begin to recognize the fact that the facilitator, individual group members, and group personality are all individual factors of importance when looking at doing group work. Whether a substance use disorder group is open or closed can also affect the dynamics of the group. And although the group are often opened in substance use disorder treatment programs, given the nature of the clientele and the pace of referrals, closed groups tend to be more found in sort of private practice, or as I said, in groups that are tailored to addressing sort of court-mandated offenders of drinking and driving. So I found that meetings with a new member, oftentimes prior to that first group, can be useful and can be very helpful as far as being able to orient that individual, even that individual in a pre-contemplative stage of readiness to change, as to the culture of the group, what it is that he or she can expect, what it is that the group is attempting to address, what it is that the facilitator or facilitators are looking for from individual members that constitute some kind of active participation. So keeping in mind that oftentimes especially with mandated groups, individuals will be looking to have their attendance and participation reported back to the referral agent. So one thing that can be done during these sort of early on meetings prior to the initial introduction to the group is allowing the client, the individual, to know that in exchange for some participation, that you, the facilitator, would be able to provide feedback to the court or feedback to the referral agency, indicating not only attendance, but also participation, and being able to sort of underscore the fact that there is this collaborative relationship that can develop as far as what's happening here. So that sort of taking a look at utilizing some time with individual members in between groups or even before that initial group can oftentimes be helpful. It's also important, I think, sometimes to recognize the fact that reluctant clients have an expectation of what the mandate means. They're expecting to be lectured or preached to. They're oftentimes going to be resentful about having been referred to treatment when they don't believe treatment is necessary. And any kind of work that the facilitator can do even before that initial group contact can help that individual begin to recognize the fact that this is not a form of punishment, but this is a form of treatment. There are sort of the idea of sort of taking a look at clients who sort of fail to engage individuals in that pre-contemplative stage of readiness to change oftentimes are going to show up at treatment being angry or resentful, especially if they've been, in their eyes, coerced into coming, whether that be officially as a court order, or whether that happens to be as a result of an employer who essentially has said, get treatment or get a new job. Being able to recognize that developing and maintaining a focus on behavior change can also be challenging. So a couple of suggestions that sometimes can be useful as far as working with individuals who are mandated, or if not officially mandated, feel sort of mandated or obliged to participate in group, or sort of starting off with some rather classic kinds of questions that are open-ended and really non-invasive. Things like, well, what are the good things about use? And beginning to sort of tease out of that conversation a sense of what it is that the individual member of the group sees as being the benefits. So in a drinking driver oriented group, it might be, what is it that the individual who uses alcohol finds to be the, quote, good things about use? Once answered and perhaps processed in the group, taking a look at where are the similarities, where are the differences between different members of the group and their understandings of what constitutes the good things about use, is then to follow that up with the sort of next stage question, which is to then ask, well, what are the less good things about use? And it's important to sort of do this in a way where you're not saying what are the problems, or how have you gotten into difficulty, or where has this become a challenge, or things of this nature, because those can sort of smack of that sort of trap that has been set for the individual and sort of negate any goodwill that you've earned by your initial question asking about what are the good things. When you ask about what are the less good things, everyone will answer as to what the less good things are. Sometimes it's very superficial. It costs too much. Other times they'll be honest and they'll talk about the fact that they've missed work, or it got them into this mandate where they have to attend this group, or whatever the case may be. So being able to sort of take a look at sort of engaging individuals in a conversation without necessarily appearing to be either invasive or attempting to trap them. So essentially what you're talking about here is kind of the backdoor approach to engaging these individuals in the group. So another way you could handle this, you might say something along the lines of, it seems, John, and you too, Phyllis, that you're not real crazy mad about being here in this mandated group. What could we do in this group that might make this seem either less invasive or less problematic, or who knows, maybe even beneficial? You know, I'm curious as to what you think could make this group work. And again, what you're doing is not only using open-ended questions, but you're also being able to ask members of the group as to what it is they believe could help. And to the extent that they offer suggestions that either as a facilitator or just knowing the dynamics of the group, you can certainly allow to take place. Again, this is another way of engaging these individuals. You've asked for their opinion, and you've created an opportunity where what it is they've said can actually become part of the work that that particular group is being done. A second strategy to use with sort of the mandated client, or those clients who are in that sort of pre-contemplative or contemplative stage, is what I affectionately refer to as a grab bag group. Now, in a grab bag group, what you would do is literally have a lunch bag, a plastic bag, any kind of bag, a box, doesn't make any difference, but in it you have slips of paper, and you'd have at least as many slips of paper as there are members of the group, but you can have more. And on each slip of paper, you would handwrite what it is that you would perhaps like to see discussed in the group. Now, these can range from really general, sort of non-invasive, sort of simple kinds of topics, like what does it feel like to be intoxicated or under the influence? A really sort of general question to which there's no specific answer, but once again, everyone in the group is going to be able to offer his or her point of view. On the other hand, it could very well be topics that are much more specific and oriented towards being able to get the group to address a particular issue of concern. What's important, however, is make sure that you would handwrite these notes that you would put into the bag. And then as you're sort of introducing the group, what you can say is, you know, I just had this idea about a group that we could do today, about an hour before group. And so I just dashed off these ideas and put them in the bag. So if you have any trouble reading my handwriting, let me know and I'll translate for you. What this does is allows you to kind of allow anyone who might have difficulty reading or is illiterate to be able to participate in the group without necessarily calling attention to him or herself and the difficulty that he or she has. So again, this is a simple little gimmick, one that I call the grab bag. And it can be tailored to whatever objective the facilitator or facilitators might have for that particular group. But I have found it to be useful, especially as far as being an icebreaker for new groups, or groups that are heavily, or open-ended groups that are heavily populated by newcomers to that particular group, and a way to be able to sort of facilitate those kinds of discussions. Being able to promote sort of an autonomy supportive environment is another sort of challenge that group facilitators often have. Those of you who are sort of students of motivational interviewing know that autonomy is a key element of being able to sort of establish that empathetic understanding relationship with clients, one that allows them to engage in ultimately change talk. The difficulty is that there are sort of different poles on this sort of continuum of autonomy. At one end, you've got anarchy, where everybody's so autonomous that they're doing their own thing, and essentially it becomes a free-for-all. I don't know about any of you, but I've had those groups, and they are tough. They are tough to handle and tough to manage. Oftentimes, when you have 2 or 3 pre-contemplative mandated clients who are very aggressive and definitely verbal about their upset in being in that group. At the other end of that continuum, however, is the sort of form of autonomy that I think Miller is talking about, in motivational interviewing. This is where the facilitator recognizes that where this individual client goes and what he or she chooses to do with regards to his or her use is entirely up to that individual. In other words, I'm not going to be able to make you stop using, but I may be able to present you with an opportunity to take a step back and refer to sort of the pros and the cons, if you will, sort of that those of you who were at the webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago, sort of taking a look at conducting a cost-benefit analysis as to what is it that I get and what is it that it costs me to get that from my particular use. So a suggestion that sometimes can be useful in being able to sort of facilitate this autonomy, this sort of allowing individual members of the group to sort of talk about what they want to talk about, or to be able to sort of affect the conversation in the group or the direction the group is going, is what I refer to as essentially sort of a music therapy group. Not in the traditional sense of music therapy, but in the sense of being able to come into that group with a playlist of songs that have been selected because the lyrics lend themselves to getting at specific issues that are of importance or significance that you would like to see addressed in the group. Now, in my experience, and not because I'm a country music fan, but because I found country music lyrics to be just such wonderful, rich sources of topics that facilitated the discussions in group, I would bring in a playlist, again, with at least as many songs on it as there are individuals in the group. But I never, ever, in all the times that I used this gimmick, was able to get through an entire playlist because the group essentially, after 4 or 5 at most songs, would essentially wind up being a sort of perpetual motion machine, if you will, in the way in which the groups would participate. I would bring copies of the lyrics to the songs and allow the individuals to have that so they could read the lyrics as they would listen to the song. But the key question that I would ask at the end of a song that facilitated the group dynamic was, who do you think this song was written for? And I would pause and I would allow individuals to think, to ruminate about this a moment, to look around and what have you. If nobody spoke up, I would say, you know, you can talk about this as being a song that was written for you, or who in the group do you think this song was written for? Once again, attempting to sort of break the ice, so to speak, with regards to this whole idea of beginning to get that conversation flowing and allow that group dynamic to take place. I always found this to be a very effective group, if for no other reason than because it was a different type of group than what sometimes would be done. You know, generally, I would not bring music into the group. So whenever this was done, it was something that by its very nature, essentially was sort of at least 1, if not 2 standard deviations out of the mean as far as group performance and the kinds of things that we did. But this idea of using music, and you can do this with video clips if you like, you can do this with any form of literature, poetry, a passage that comes from literature, maybe even television programs. Again, be creative, but essentially what you're doing is you're using something from the popular culture to allow individuals in the group to begin to relate to that. This accomplishes something else in addition to your initial or your immediate objective of engaging the group. It also begins to allow them to recognize the fact that the popular culture itself can actually become useful. I would oftentimes invite individuals, for example, to look at Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, and look at Dracula as being a metaphor for alcoholism or addiction, and going through everything from not being able to see one's reflection in the mirror to being shapeshifters to sort of taking a look at the parasitic nature, the sort of romantic, if not sexual, undertones in that whole relationship. But again, music, film, YouTube clips, television, literature, poetry, all can become vehicles that can help sort of facilitate discussion in the group. Jess, in a number of the cases that you sent me in advance of today, a common theme that ran through many of them was this idea of working with that mandated client. And you need to remember that old adage, as it says on the slide here, about the carrot or the stick. And very often, historically, the stick had been used. Essentially, I can remember in the early days of working in groups back before I was introduced to motivational interviewing and knew anything about Prochaska and DiClementi's work, and basically just had the training that I had received in the old sort of attack therapy, as Miller called it. Very often being discharged, therapeutically discharged from the group was a threat that was held over the head of individuals for non-participation. Problem with this is that in the area where I was working, I would oftentimes have Native American clients and individuals who would be coming into treatment for whom talking about oneself, especially in a group format, was not only alien, but it was antithetical to what they had been taught as being proper behavior. So the whole idea of group therapy was alien, let alone something that would be important with regards to looking at substance use disorder. So again, keeping in mind that old adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So a couple of suggestions that might become interesting here become sort of this idea of sort of taking a look at asking individuals how they might become involved in that group. This is something that can be done either in advance of the group when you're talking about new individuals who are coming into the program, but it also can be done in between the groups or perhaps even in the group itself. So this idea of is sort of taking a look at inviting individuals to address any kind of resentments or hostilities that might be displayed with regards to this feeling of having been forced into this situation. So mandated clients are often in that pre-contemplative sort of stage of change, and they're prone to being resentful about being in treatment. So one way to address this resentment is to help individuals, and if there are several of these individuals in the group, being able to sort of take a look at ways of addressing them simultaneously. It's very often the case when we're looking at driving under the influence groups of this nature. So often an alternative is being able to sort of to take a look at asking them, what was the alternative to your being in this particular group? And it's not uncommon that I would hear individuals say, well, I was given the choice of either X number of weekends in jail or some huge fine or coming to these stupid meetings. And I'd say, so help me understand here. And I would kind of lapse into my best Columbo-esque routine. And I realize I'm dating myself here, being an old sort of student of the Columbo television series about the detective who kind of played dumb, but really was the smartest man in the room. But in my best Columbo-esque routine, I'd say, help me understand here. I'm a little bit confused. You seem to be telling me that coming here was better than spending X number of weekends in jail, to which the individual would say yes. To which I would then come back and say, okay, it sounds like what you're telling me, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like what you're telling me is we here in this group have presented you with the opportunity to avoid something you really, really didn't want to do. And again, casting the group, casting yourself as the facilitator, as actually being an ally to the extent that essentially what's being done here is having presented individuals the opportunity to choose, yes, a bad option, but one that's a small b bad rather than a capital B bad, like spending 6 or 10 or however many weekends in jail. And again, it kind of offers this opportunity to move the needle just a little bit to being able to see the facilitators specifically and the group in general as being something that isn't necessarily an adversary, something that might just be potentially beneficial. Some additional suggestions can include things like being able to actually come up with a contract. To the extent that you've had that meeting with a client to orient him or her to what's going to be going on in the group prior to their first group meeting, which is not uncommon at all. And to be able to, when you get the sense that this is somebody who's really resentful about being here and probably is going to have a great deal of difficulty participating in the group, is to kind of offer a contract, be that a verbal or a written contract, where in exchange for providing timely and accurate information about participation, attendance, things of this nature, what you would be looking for in exchange is, and then this is where you would fill in whatever, or you would negotiate with the client what was acceptable. What I oftentimes found was in the very beginning, the first group or two, that I would be asking in exchange for me documenting participation and attendance, that the individual would make one spontaneous comment in group and one response to something else that had been said in group. That was it. Anything else was gravy, and anything else would be greatly appreciated, but all that the individual would have to do is to make one spontaneous comment and then to make one sort of reaction to something else that someone said in group. Then as the group progressed over subsequent meetings, perhaps even over subsequent weeks, maybe if the individual didn't become more participatory, actually upping the ante, so to speak, as far as continued reports on attendance and participation, and looking for the individual to become a little bit more particular in how he would handle this. Another option that I found to be particularly helpful is what's referred to as a life story group. Now, this is not an uncommon strategy to be used in treatment facilities, where individuals who come in would be giving their life story. But oftentimes it would be something that would be expected of individuals very early in their treatment. And I found that this was not particularly useful for me. In other words, someone who's in that precontemplative stage of readiness to change and is now being told to give his or her life story either would flat out refuse, if not therapeutically discharge, or would give some superficial sort of maybe even made up story that really did not help as far as the ultimate objective of group and being able to help this individual recognize his or her difficulty with alcohol or other substances. What I would do instead is, first of all, let individuals know in advance that life story was a part of what we did in this group. Second of all, to the extent that this is an inpatient facility where group is happening daily, or outpatient, like an intensive outpatient setting where individuals are having groups several times a week, is to, first of all, have them sit in on at least one life story group to realize that this was not an opportunity to gang up on the person who was telling the life story. And in many cases, that it was a very positive experience where the group itself and the facilitator would provide positive feedback to the individual who shared his or her story, so that when it came time for John Jones or Mary Brown to share that story, that they were, first of all, knowing what was expected and what would likely be the outcome, and second of all, feeling a little bit more like this was something that was designed to engage them in the process, if you will, to make the best out of a difficult situation. So what we're looking at here are strategies that can sometimes be useful with that mandated client. This opportunity to sort of either invite the patient, the individual client, to recognize that the group may very well have been a better alternative than the others that were offered by the court, and or using something like a life story group and being able to set the individual up to understand what that is and how it operated, and then to actually observe life stories before actually having to give that life story. So there are different types of gimmicks, different things that can be done, different strategies. And while I'm sharing several of them today that came out of my experience, I need to tell you that all of these were sort of ideas that occurred to me. They came to me, you know, sort of spontaneously. And I would encourage you to actually use your own creative ways to look for different approaches, be they backdoor, using gimmicks, strategies, using audiovisual aids, being able to use other kinds of things. For example, in the webinar that we did 2 weeks ago, I talked about an experience of actually using a calculator to allow individuals to calculate the number of calories that they had consumed in their usual pattern of drinking, in order to be able to shift the focus from looking at their drinking as being number of drinks consumed to number of calories consumed, and being a way of being able to understand the extent to which their use had become somewhat of an issue of concern. So what we're talking about here is creating strategies that would allow you to engage that pre-contemplative or contemplative client. And keep in mind, pre-contemplative is a $10 counselor phrase that simply means, I don't see myself as having a problem. And in essence, what we're doing in addressing these individuals in groups, and when you've got a group like a drinking driver group, essentially the majority of individuals in that group are likely to be contemplative, or excuse me, pre-contemplative, if not contemplative. This idea of being able to use sort of the consciousness raising strategies or ways of being able to invite them to take a look at their use from a somewhat different perspective. So one particular kind of group that I found particularly useful with this population is what is the old-fashioned, those of you familiar with group theory and have taken group classes in college and read books on group, the psychoeducational group. In essence, it's the opportunity for the group to learn a few things. A couple of twists on this, however. Being able to take a look, for example, in a drinking driver group, of being able to use the blood alcohol level that was recorded at the time of arrest as a way of calculating the individual's number of drinks consumed. Now, I can't tell you the number of times that I used this strategy, but one thing I can tell you is that every time I did, individuals in the group argued with my findings. I can remember one case in particular talking with an individual who swore he had 2 drinks the night he was arrested. And he was really, really angry about being mandated to come to these, quote, stupid groups, unquote. Well, it's interesting, when we took a look at his blood alcohol level and we calculated the fact that he had had 16 drinks and he argued that he only had 2, he was right. He only had 2 drinks, 2 8-ounce water glasses of 4 Roses whiskey, which is the equivalent to 16 shots of 4 Roses. In essence, being able to educate individuals oftentimes can present a way to be able to sort of take a look at engaging them in this group process. And doing so not with the 2x4 upside the head arguing, which Miller in motivational interviewing talks about as the death of a meaningful discussion of change, and rather taking a look at sneaking in the back door. And as you may have heard me say a couple of weeks ago, my grandfather used to say, whether you storm in the front door or you sneak in the back door, it's just as warm by the fire. And it's this idea of being able to invite individuals to discover things about their use that present them with the opportunity to look at that use from a somewhat slightly different perspective. So it's this idea of being able to sort of use any variety of opportunities to educate the group, perhaps about, again, looking at drinking driver groups, because so often these are heavily populated with not only mandated, but pre-contemplative or contemplative individuals. The idea of being able to take a look at what constitutes a standard drink, the role that medications or that eating might play in blood alcohol level, the way in which different kinds of genetic factors, the difference between how men and women metabolize alcohol and the impact that can have on blood alcohol level, et cetera, et cetera. Again, all of these present an opportunity to sort of sneak information in that suggests that things are not always the way they appear to be. Again, keep in mind that my usual number of drinks is my normal number of drinks, which is my okay number of drinks, which means it's a safe number of drinks. To the extent that I can do something to disrupt that, and I begin to kind of scratch my head and begin to wonder if maybe what causes a problem is a problem when it causes problems. The same thing can be done with marijuana, can be done with other kinds of drugs by taking a look at translating use into dollars, into time spent, into who knows what. You be creative as far as being able to use the educational groups. Some other gimmicks that become important, and we'll sort of, I will end my formal presentation with this here, is sort of taking a look at a couple of my favorites that I would use quite often. One I affectionately referred to as the bottle gang. Now, I use the bottle gang because at the time I was using this quite frequently, the predominant substance or drug of choice was alcohol. And in this particular group, I would sort of set the group room up where underneath my chair in the group room, I would have a bag. And in the bag, there would be whatever the particular kind of alcohol was that seemed to be the favorite of most members of the group. So if it was beer, it would be a beer bottle. If it was liquor, it would be a vodka bottle. And what I would do is I would have the bottle. If it was clear glass and it was a beer bottle, I'd have it filled with ginger ale. If it was a colored bottle, it would be filled with water. I'd have a cap on it. I would have made sure that it had been in the refrigerator for several hours before group. And what I would do is I'd reach under my chair, I would take out the bag, I would go over to John Jones or Mary Brown, and I would give them the bag and ask them to tell me what was inside. They would reach inside, and the first thing they would feel is the discernible shape of a beer bottle or a liquor bottle. They would feel it cold, perhaps even with some condensation on the edge of it. I would ask them to take it out, look at them, and then I'd say, "What are you feeling?" Now, keep in mind, this gimmick is, in my estimation, only appropriate for an inpatient group. You don't want to use something that's going to set off triggers where an hour or two or four later, the individual is going to be out on his or her own. So this is a gimmick that I would only use in inpatient facilities where, again, I have the opportunity to not only continue to work with this individual after group, but also to I and the other members of the staff to keep an eye on this individual. You can do this with any kind of substance to the extent that you are adept at rolling your own cigarettes. You would bring in rolling papers and oregano and you would roll a joint. To the extent that you're talking about some other kind of, you would bring in a bong and some loose oregano, or be creative. But again, it's this idea of catching people off guard with what oftentimes are rather pronounced and can be very powerful triggers. And once again, and I underscore this and I reiterate it because it's so important, don't do this in an outpatient group. This is something that I would only recommend doing where there's the opportunity to really process it. And by that, I don't mean just in the group itself, but I even mean allowing the rest of the staff in the inpatient facility to know what you're doing and why you're doing it, so that they are able to also continue to help this individual process these issues afterwards. Another icebreaker is what I oftentimes refer to as the Golden Doorstop Award. Now, this is one that works particularly well with open groups, but can be used in a closed group as well. It can also be done in inpatient or outpatient facilities. But the Golden Doorstop Award quite literally is just taking a piece of wood, cutting it in the shape of a doorstop, painting it gold, and then taking it into group with you. I used to do this once a week. And what I would do is I would simply ask the group, okay, folks, who do you think we should give the golden doorstop to this week? And the golden doorstop was a gimmick that was designed as a sort of metaphor for someone who had done work in group that week. And we want to make sure that the door that they started to open didn't slam shut again. Again, it was a metaphor for being able to keep that door open. The rules of the Golden Doorstop Award were quite simple. You can nominate anybody you like, including yourself. All you need to do is explain why the person who you nominate receives the nomination. And everybody in the group would then have to nominate. And to the extent that you have a group with 10 individuals in it, and John Jones gets 6 votes, and Mary Brown gets 3, and somebody else gets 1, John Jones gets the award that week. And then you would put onto the golden doorstop with Sharpie the initials of John Jones, JJ, and the date. And when the golden doorstop was filled up with initials from all the people who had earned that golden doorstop, it's retired to a place of prominence in the group room, and a new golden doorstop is made. And over the course of months and years, eventually you wind up seeing that there are 2, 5, 10, a dozen golden doorstops that have been retired. Again, each one representing the fact that predecessors in group had made project, and that the group had recognized the progress that had been made and had awarded the golden doorstop. So again, there are more suggestions and gimmicks. They're outlined in a chapter that I've written on this. A link to that chapter is at the very end of this PowerPoint presentation. And later in the webinar, Jess will show that so that people can link to it if they wish to. But I think that's enough for me. Let's take a look at some of your sort of cases that are coming in, and you can sort of take the screen back over.
Okie dokie. Thank you so much. We've gotten some really positive feedback. I won't share all of it because we don't have enough time, but people really appreciate all the years of experience they have access to. All right, so let me see. I'm going to make myself the presenter, and I'm going to start. I'm going to convey some questions to you that are not very complex. And then I will also add some cases, and I'll share some of those because they're longer, they're more descriptions of stories. So one of the questions we had is, how about tips for initial engagement and orientation, getting people into groups in the first time? And I think that's especially for open groups.
Well, one of the things that I found particularly helpful, as I had mentioned earlier, was that sort of initial meeting with those newcomers to the group, and to kind of orient them as to what they could expect, but also was an opportunity for them to sort of size me up, to get a sense of everything from my tone of voice to my background. It also allowed me the opportunity to get a sense of who they were as individuals. And quite importantly, being able to understand some of the cultural issues that might very well be at play here. And by cultural, I'm not talking about racial necessarily. I'm not talking about issues that are really obvious that you can kind of guess at, if you will, by virtue of the number of tattoos someone has, or what it is that their referral agent had included in the case summary. It's by being able to get a sense of eye contact, getting a sense of syntax, getting a sense of where they are at and how they kind of view the world, their worldview, if they will. So it's an opportunity for me to size them up and an opportunity for them to size me up, so that when the group does start and this individual has been introduced, being able to then know what I should or perhaps should not do as a way of being able to increase the likelihood that this particular individual would become involved. It was not uncommon that I might allow an individual to actually sit through a first group in order to get a sense of how it is that I facilitated the group and how it is that the other group members acted, not only individually in the group, but also towards each other. Another strategy that I would sometimes use as well, especially if, for example, we had had 2 or 3 individuals who had graduated that week, and this was an inpatient program, and maybe 1 or 2 therapeutic discharges, meaning that we were having 40% of the group turnover, would be to ask the quote old timers in the group if they could orient the newcomers to the group as to what it is that we've been doing here, rather than allowing me to be the one who would tell everyone what was going on, being able to ask them. And obviously, I'm going to ride herd over what those people are saying. If there is a ringer in the crowd who's basically saying this is don't waste your time. I'm only here because the judge says so. If you can sign yourself, get the hell out of here. Obviously, I'm going to cut that off, and I'm going to process that in a different way. But to the extent that you have a fair number of newcomers to that group, being able to actually ask the group if it would orient the newcomers to the group. So working in advance of the group, maybe even being able to speak one-on-one with an individual after the group was over, saying, do you have any questions? What was your sense of how that went? Can you see yourself as the group sessions progress, sort of fitting into this? What is it that we can do that might make it a little bit more welcoming to you? How is it that your understanding of what was going to happen is different than what we did today? Things of this nature as a way of processing that first or those early groups one-on-one with that individual afterwards.
Fantastic. I think we have another question that just came in that is related but a bit different. This person says, how do you engage and support an individual of color in a predominantly white group?
That's a particularly difficult one. And especially, you look in the dictionary under white guy and you find my picture. I'm the classic, apparently, and whether it was the color of my skin or whether it was the way I would dress, any and all of those kinds of things. And especially if there were numbers of individuals who were racially different than this newcomer to the group, that's a challenge to handle. However, I'm going to know that in advance. In other words, if I know, Jess, that you're coming in, and it just so happens in this inpatient group, you're going to be the only woman that's going to be in that particular group. One of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to prepare you for that. I'm going to talk with you about the fact that, one of the things that you're going to notice immediately when you come in, Jess, is that you're the only woman in this group. Or you're the only African American, or you're the only Asian American, or the only fill in the blank with whatever that particular issue of difference or perceived difference might be, and ask what I can do to help you feel a little bit more comfortable with that. By the same token, to the extent that I've been working with this group in advance of your coming into it, I have a sense of whether this is going to be an issue or it's not going to be an issue. And to the extent that it's not going to be an issue, then being able once again to use the group as a way of welcoming the individual. Even to the extent that maybe even making this somewhat ritualistic as far as how the group welcomes new people when they're coming in. And again, whether it's done in concert with one of the other gimmicks that we've discussed or is outlined in that chapter that I've mentioned or not, this idea of being able to use all that I know in advance to sort of help me help this individual find a spot that's at least less um, awkward than it might be perceived to be by that individual when he or she comes in. And by that I mean everything I know about my own background, my own experience in previous groups in dealing with these kinds of situations, what worked and what didn't work, my own understanding of the personality of this particular group and how it's likely to respond to a new member coming in, especially a new member of color or a new member with a different sexual orientation or gender or significantly different in age or speaks with an accent or whatever the case may be. And then also being able to sort of get a feel for this newcomer to the group so that I can better be prepared for what's likely to come. Because it's not always going to work out well. There are going to be challenges and issues. And being able to sort of take a look at what are some of my favorite go-to problem solvers if and when those problems come up can be quite helpful. And by the way, those problems will come up, and being able to act on them instead of react to them goes a long ways, because the more I am proactive in addressing those issues when they come up, the more the group is going to have confidence in me as the facilitator of the group, and the more he or she is going to, the newcomer is going to trust me as being there to sort of ride herd over the group and to be able to assist that sort of integration into that group.
Wonderful. There's been a couple of questions about young people, and I know that's an area that you have a lot of expertise in. So how do you engage youth groups, because it seems that they resist most gimmicks? And then someone else, I don't know if I can find the exact question here, but they said, what do you do when a young person says that the group is corny? Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, there's only, I think, so much that a facilitator can control, and there's only a certain sort of a finite number of strategies or gimmicks that I may have. Now, that's not to say that number of strategies and gimmicks doesn't grow with time and experience. Oftentimes, as a result of some of the spontaneous things that I've done to sort of address those issues when they come up. But again, it's really difficult to be able to take a precontemplative individual who's willing to latch on to any difference he or she can notice in the group as being the reason why this is not going to work and why I can't fit in here, and overcome that in a very short amount of time. Now, to the extent that I've got a captive audience in the form of someone who's been mandated, where the consequences of being either therapeutically discharged, and I'm not a big fan of therapeutic discharge, that's a last resort, not a go-to threat, or the individual who, if it's a voluntary program, can sign him or herself out. Again, to the extent that I have a captive audience, sometimes the best way to deal with that is to let it slide. By that I mean to sort of not sort of make it an issue. Let me give you an example. I can remember one clinical staff meeting where we would meet weekly, where we would staff all new clients that had come in during the previous week to group. And my colleagues were all interested in therapeutically discharging this individual for lack of participation. He did not say one word in any group all week. And there were 2 groups a day, and he had been there for 7 days. So for 14 groups, he did not say a word. And they wanted to therapeutically discharge him. I reminded them that he was, I won't mention the tribe, but he was a member of a Native American tribe in New York State, and that he was being asked to do the very thing that was antithetical to the way he had been raised. He had been raised on the reservation, and this was a very traditional tribe in New York State. And I explained to them that essentially what they were looking for him to do was something that A, he didn't know how to do, and B, even if he was forced to do it, that he would probably rather suffer the consequences that would come from being discharged. Now, the question that your viewer asked had to do specifically with young people or adolescents. These are for me, are very difficult or challenging individuals to work with. My experience has predominantly been with 18 to 22-year-olds, but as you can well imagine, I've worked with a lot of 18-year-olds who are going on 35 and a lot of 22-year-olds who are going on 15. And so the idea of being able to kind of engage individuals was very difficult. Now, what worked for me, and again, I can't guarantee that this would work for everyone, but was to essentially ask, what do you want? You know, how will you know if this is working? What is it that you expected? And to the extent that somebody was expecting something that I knew was not going to be happening in the group, promising that individual that it was not going to happen. Or to the extent that it was something that the individual did want to have happen in group, promising that it would. In essence, being able to, again, enter into a sort of verbal agreement, if you will, although I was not necessarily asking that particular individual to do anything, I was making a commitment to behave in a particular way. Also, I think that being able to give that individual some opportunity to orient to the group and to become somewhat familiar with what was going to be going on, and then to just see how the group operated can also be very useful. And by that I mean being patient, allowing this individual to realize that overcoming their preconceived expectations of what would be happening is not going to happen simply because I said it was going to happen. It might take several sessions to do this. Now, that being said, if I've got a group with one 17-year-old in it and then a bunch of 45-year-old guys, especially if we're talking about the 17-year-old being obviously, and I use the word obviously in quotes, to the rest of the group different, you know, tattoos or multicolored hair, or you fill in the blank with whatever it happens to be, that is a tough row to hoe. To the extent that I'm working in a facility that has multiple teams. For example, in the inpatient program I worked in, we had 4 separate teams. Being able to assign this individual to a different team where the makeup of the group was such that it was a little bit either less exclusive or more inclusive might be the way to sort of handle that particular situation. So that instead of a group of 10 clients, 9 of whom are over 45 and 1 of them is 17, being able to refer that individual to my colleagues on team B, who essentially were working with a group at that time that was composed of something that at the very least was more understanding of, if not more similar to that individual. But to specifically address the viewer's question, this is a tough question and one that I struggled with often.
We've had a couple of questions in the same categories, and I want to make sure that we touch on this topic, and you may have less experience with this, but it's about virtual groups and telehealth. So one question is, how do you engage people if it is a virtual group? And also, someone specifically asked, how might you adapt the grab bag technique, which I think I personally, and I know some of our viewers really love the way that you framed the issue of reading and messy handwriting. But do you have thoughts about how this could be done virtually?
Unfortunately, I don't. I retired before the virtual age really came full blown here. So the only way I can respond to that question is sort of off the top of my head and not from experience. So I have to qualify anything I say in response to this by basically saying I'm talking through my hat here. This idea of virtual, the thing that I think that becomes most important, and you can recall this perhaps from our very first webinar that we did together, is to be familiar with the platform that's being used so as to be able to not only use it effectively, but also know all of the gimmicks or all of the ins and the outs, all of the tricks, if you will, of that particular platform that allow you to do everything from mute and shift issues to recognizing the fact that with a virtual platform, being able to allow all members of the group to see everybody in the group in the context of a group is challenging. Yes, I realize you can have everybody's thumbnail up on the screen at the same time, but it becomes very difficult to see yourself as part of that group when you're looking at 11 or 12 thumbnails that are on the screen. So I think that another way to handle that is that sometimes the facilitator is going to have to be a little bit more, I don't know if the word assertive is the correct term, or a little bit more directive as far as being able to direct specific, and I would recommend open-ended questions to John Jones or Mary Brown. In other words, yes, I have 12 thumbnails that are up on the screen at the same time, but the likelihood is that you're looking at the speaker or whoever is speaking at that particular time, or you're focused on the best looking guy or the best looking girl in the group, or you're focused on who knows whatever it is that called your attention. And therefore, the facilitator is going to need to make sure that he or she or they are scanning, I think, all of those thumbnails that are up in order to be able to look for some of those telltale signs, whether it's eye contact issues or facial expressions, or being able to sort of look for other telltale cues. The other problem with virtual is that you folks don't realize right now that I'm sitting here with my Bermuda shorts on. I've got my tie and shirt on to sort of affect my professional appearance, but I'm barefoot and with my Bermuda shorts sitting in the sunroom of my house right now. The same is true with this virtual group that's being run, to the extent that we're not seeing all of the body language. Yes, there are facial expressions and things of this nature, but there's also, crossed legs and fidgeting, tapping knees and tapping toes and all kinds of things that are indicative of anxiety or angst or something that might cause a facilitator in a real group to be able to sort of direct the attention to that individual, or being able to support that particular person in group that just is absent. Now, I realize in this day and age, especially right now when we're all social distancing and sort of using social isolation and having to turn to virtual vehicles to continue our work, and it's so much better now than it was even 5 or 10 years ago. The point still remains is that there is and are vital pieces missing. So to go back to my opening comments, these are just some reactions based upon going to church in virtual settings and some of the things that you and I, Jess, have been doing here, rather than experience that allows me to speak definitively with an answer to that particular question.
Thank you. I am also wearing my Bermuda shorts, so. So we've had a couple of questions that I think might be good because you have not really touched on this issue before, I don't think so far. We've talked about sort of reluctant participation, people who don't speak, but what about time management and people that want to dominate the group discussion?
That's a particularly interesting one, and there are two ways I think you can handle that. One is rather directive, and that is where the facilitator engages that individual. But in some ways, that's antithetical to what group is all about. Rather, it's sort of taking a look at being able to sort of direct the group to address those issues that are being presented by that individual. Now, this can range from something as simple and perhaps obvious as saying, you know, it appears to me that John has really been spending a lot of time handling this particular, speaking in this group today. Who else might have something to say on this topic? To actually then asking the group, has anyone else noticed what I've noticed, that John seems to be really, I'm not sure whether it's intentional or unintentional, but sort of taking over this group. Or a third option is to say, you know, John, you really seem to have a lot to say today. I'm kind of curious as to what's going on. This isn't your usual pattern in group. What is it that's got you so talkative today? Another thing that can be done, and again, this falls under the heading of psychoeducational group, but is actually to the extent that this is something that is becoming somewhat of a habit, in that this is the third group this week in which John has done this, is be able to bring pads of paper for everyone in the group and pencils for everyone in the group, and do something of a sociogram of the group. In other words, being able to track who is speaking to whom and how often and things of this nature. And what happens when you do a sociogram is that you essentially wind up drawing a picture of the communication that's taking place in that. This can also be very helpful for the facilitator as well, if for no other reason than it sometimes can show that the facilitator has been facilitating a bit more than he or she perhaps should. Again, Miller talks about the writing reflex, the idea of wanting to step in and fix things. And to the extent that John has been attempting to dominate the group, instead of sort of directing the group to sort of engage John, and by that I don't mean gang up on him or to quarantine him or to ostracize him, but I mean to sort of help John recognize what's going on. It wouldn't surprise me that a client who is doing this with some degree of regularity, this is the way essentially he's handled those who have confronted his substance use disorder out in the, quote, real world, unquote. But being able to sort of avoid the temptation to engage in the writing reflex in group, just as it's important to avoid that writing reflex in individual therapy as well.
Okay, fantastic. We have got a few suggestions about how to do telehealth. It sounds like, you know, people who are in the field right now, of course, are grappling with these issues. So I encourage everybody to take a look at the chat and the Q&A if you're thinking, I'd like to see some of my colleagues' ideas. And of course, if you have any thoughts about how you're doing telehealth these days, I know that would be valuable to the other folks on the webinar. We've gotten a couple of questions that I am qualified to answer, and there's not very many of those. So the first one is, can we have a copy of the PowerPoint? And the answer is yes. We'll be making a PDF of this PowerPoint presentation and sharing it with all of you. Also, is this webinar being recorded? The answer is yes. I can see the recording button right here. So we're going to share that, of course, with those of you who participated today, and you'll be able to share with any of your colleagues that weren't able to attend. And we do also have a question about resources. Dr. Chapman has put together a short list of resources that he recommends. I sent that out to registrants yesterday, but if you registered after that, you didn't receive it. Therefore, look for that in the follow-up email as well, so you'll have it with you. Did you want to reference any particular resource, Dr. Chapman?
No, there are so many resources, but interestingly, there's not a lot of literature as yet with regards to sort of looking at the sort of nexus of stages of readiness to change, motivational interviewing, and group work. There are some, and I've included a couple links to those resources online, and they are sort of refereed journal papers that individuals can take a look at. But no, I don't have any additional ones off the top of my head. But I certainly can, if there are specific questions, I welcome individuals to email me with specific questions, and I'm happy to do a little bit of research. That's one of the luxuries of being retired and sitting on the banks of the Potomac River, is that I have some time to do things like that. I also would add that in the PowerPoint that you're going to be making available, Jess, are my clinical notes that I've written, many of which were the sort of backdrop for the comments that I've made today. So in addition to the scant few words that are on the slides themselves, there are rather extensive notes that I've written for each slide, and that's available to your viewers.
It's true. I can vouch for that. Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions, and let's see if we can challenge your, I would say, relentless optimism and positivity here. Someone says, when do you kick someone out of a group? When would you consider ejecting someone from the group to maintain the process and therapy?
Well, clearly, whenever an individual is presenting a threat to the safety or well-being of members of the group, and by that I'm obviously overt threats of violence in the group or actions that engage in some kind of inappropriate behavior, but even verbal threats or in an outpatient group, things like, you know, I know where you live, or who knows, whatever kinds of things. That clearly is going to be something that you're going to want to discuss, at least with a supervisor, or if you have the opportunity to clinically process your groups with colleagues, being able to kind of get a sense for. I think also, to the extent that individuals are having difficulty participating in a group, you need to first of all take a look at what are sort of the rules, if you will, or the sort of terms of engagement that are expected of individuals in order to engage in some kind of definition of active participation. The challenge is going to be taking a look at not therapeutically discharging someone as punishment as much as using the therapeutic discharge as a way of recognizing the fact that, you know, you can't make friends with a mad dog, and being able to recognize the fact that somebody may be so unready for this particular form of treatment as to be inappropriate not only for his or her benefit, but also is detrimental to the opportunity for the rest of the group. That said, this may be somebody that you want to kind of terminate from the group, but engage in one-on-one counseling, or being able to take a look at it as a referral to a different group. Or to the extent that you have a colleague who is particularly adept at dealing with these kinds of clients, making or facilitating a referral to that individual. You know, just because I'm good at doing group doesn't mean I'm good at doing all groups with all different kinds of clients. And being able to take a look at all of the different tools that are available to me, both to use with this group that I am facilitating, but also with regards to being able to help this client benefit by working with another therapist or a different agency or something of this nature. So the sort of quick and dirty answer to the question, I think, is I would resist the temptation to therapeutically discharge as punishment, and use that instead as being a way in which to better serve the client and the other clients who are in my group.
Great. What have you done about sleeping in group?
Well, I usually set an alarm so I wake up rather quickly, but you know, it's interesting. That's not an issue that came up very often. But to the extent that it did, I can remember a couple of occasions where things that I would do would simply be sort of giving a sort of a nonverbal cue to somebody sitting to the right or the left to just kind of, give a look. I'm doing this. You couldn't see it before. That's one of the limitations of the virtual environment that we're in, is a little nudge, if you will. To the extent that the individual was really continuing to fall asleep, I would need to determine whether this was, are we looking at somebody who's so early in treatment that they hadn't completed their detox? Is this somebody who perhaps there is a clinical explanation for this? Once again, I'm not going to look to punish somebody for displaying symptoms of something that is understandable. That said, to the extent that this is a pre-contemplative client who has all but thumbed his or her nose at the group, and essentially, whether they are literally asleep and snoring, or whether the individual is just feigning sleep or whatever, is we're going to engage that as a group. I might very well, with John Jones or Mary Brown, quote, asleep, unquote, ask Phyllis and Harold and Jorge, how are you feeling right now with John or Phyllis or Mary being asleep? And again, allow it to be processed in the group. Or what would you want the group to do if you had fallen asleep? Once again, it's all about, and this is what facilitating groups is all about, I think. It's all about being able to take a look at allowing the group to do the work. Again, the group is the engine that drives the car. I may be behind the steering wheel, but again, it's the group that's the engine that makes this work. And again, it's more effective to have a group and be able to see 10 individuals, and it's more cost effective, and we're able to charge each individual $50 a session rather than $150 a session. But the bottom line is that it's also very effective therapeutic strategy for being able to engage individuals who have a substance use disorder. So again, there are probably, I used to tell my students in Philadelphia, there are a lot of ways to get to New York City aside from I-95. And it's a question of taking a look at the variables that are of importance at this particular moment in time, and which of those is best suited to address the fact that John Jones or Mary Brown fell asleep.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So I do think, that we're going to have to stop taking any more questions, but we do have a log of these questions, and so I'll be able to pass them along to Dr. Chapman, and if he sees anything that he thinks would be particularly valuable to answer, I can include that on our posted resource, which will be in our webinar library. So I apologize. I wish that everybody had time to get their question answered, but thank you so much for all of the questions and cases that you submitted. Before I get into some housekeeping stuff, did you have any final thoughts, Dr. Chapman, about this topic?
Just to the extent that any of the people present in the webinar have a bit of time, I would recommend that they read the chapter that I wrote on gimmicks for group. I apologize in advance. It was written 20 years ago. So the nomenclature that I use is very archaic and out of date. I talk about things like drug dependence and so on and so forth. The gimmicks are just as timely and useful today as they were then. It's just that the nomenclature has changed, and please don't discount the gimmicks because the words just make me sound like I don't know what I'm talking about.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It was very well attended, and people are chatting to us that they found it so informative and useful. So now I'm going to share my screen. For those of you who don't care about CEUs and certificates, this may stop being relevant to you, but all the same, I will share it, and you can, let's see, you can learn a little bit about getting your CEUs. So in order to get your CEUs, you're going to need to log into your My IRETA account. Again, I'm going to reiterate that they will not be immediately available. If you log in right after you finish here, you won't see them. It takes us about 48 hours to make sure that you did actually attend this presentation. But assuming that time has passed, you'll be able to log into your My IRETA account and click on the name of the webinar. Scroll down to the bottom of the page and you will see these options: NADAC CEUs, PCB CEUs, or just a certificate of attendance. All of those are free. Then, of course, you can instantly download it and you should be good to go. Finally, I want to thank you all for attending our webinars and to let you know that there is one next week. Typically, we have them on Wednesdays, but this one is going to be on Thursday afternoon. And the topic is cannabis therapeutics and policy. So we've already got a lot of attendance for that. And if you're interested, please join us. We'll have more webinars posted soon. And finally, if you have questions about this webinar or if you have questions about our work in general, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. You can email us at info@ireta.org. And if you want to be more connected with us and stay in touch, you can subscribe to our newsletters or connect with us on social media. Again, I want to thank everybody for taking the time today, and especially thank you very much, Dr. Chapman, for sharing your knowledge with us and preparing this presentation. Again, get in touch with any questions and look for some emails from IRETA in the next day or two. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Thank you all for your time. Have a good afternoon.